I already have started 2 sessions before talking on this sutra. Since today is the first day, maybe I may as well start from a PowerPoint. So right now we are holding in our hands a booklet, the smaller Sukhavati Vyuha and the Sutra of Visualizing the Buddha of Immeasurable Length of Life. Now, it is the smaller Sukhavati Vyuha that we're talking about. And this smaller Sukhavati Vyuha is also called the Sutra on Amitabha Buddha. So actually, the Sutra on Amitabha Buddha is a sutra that we'll be lecturing on and until finished, like the Diamond Sutra. And from now on, maybe I'll use the PowerPoint for the convenience of those who like to take notes during the session. Buddhism is not just a superstition of worshiping and meditating. There's a lot of profound and subtle philosophy in it. It has been a spiritual teaching for 2,600 years. It has its very significant impact on human civilization, the human culture. Now, right now, without further ado, I'll start on the Sutra on Amitabha Buddha, spoken by Sakyamuni Buddha. In the Chinese language, it is called Fo Suo Amito Jing. In the Cantonese language, is Phật Sut Amito Kinh. And spoken by Sakyamuni Buddha, because this sutra 2,600 years ago was spoken by our historical Buddha. There is such a historical Buddha in the history of humans, of human civilization 2,600 years ago in India. It's not a fake story, it's a fact that such a Buddha exists according to the history of the world, according to the history of India. The Sutra on Amitabha Buddha, translated into Chinese from Sanskrit by Kumarajiva around 400 AD. The way I am lecturing on a sutra is a combination of philosophy, literature, how it applies to common life, to daily life. And there's also an academic side to it, because there's a lot of researches done on sutras, and a lot of researches done on Sanskrit. So I would take a combination of all of these. It's not just simply explaining it according to philosophy or explaining it according to how it relates to our everyday life. It has to be covering all facets. So that's the way we'll treat it, because we're getting more and more advanced. We've been here for 10 years, except for those who come for the first time, and you may not know about it. We've been here for a number of years. It's time to absorb more into it. And as a matter of fact, we're planning on, this is as a sidetrack of what we're talking about, we're planning on setting up what we call a Sunday and Saturday Buddhist Academy. We'll start with a Sanskrit course and a Chinese course, of course, and then we will slowly, gradually develop it into more courses. But anyway, let's get back to this. The Sutra on Amitabha Buddha, translated into Chinese from Sanskrit by Kumarajiva around 400 AD. 400 AD is approximately about 1600 years ago, 1,600 years ago. Kumarajiva was an Indian monk who lived in Kucha, which is the present-day Xinjiang. That's about 1,600 years ago. And he came to China. He was a prince. He was going to succeed his father to be a king, but he didn't want to be a king. He wanted to be a monk. Why did he want to be a monk? Because he wanted to go on to a spiritual odyssey in which he can find liberation for humans, not just for himself, for all sentient beings who suffer from the hardship of life. So he wanted to forsake his throne and become a monk and in search of his way. He's been learning Chinese, and from literature we know that this monk was able to speak at least 20 languages. He's a genius in languages. Some people, even in some literature, it even mentions that he understands the language of the birds. In other words, if the bird is singing, he knows what that bird feels. But anyway, Kumarajiva, around 400 AD, he came to China, he set up a translation academy in China, training approximately about 800 Chinese monks studying Sanskrit. And he was the main translator, translating a lot of sutras from Sanskrit into Chinese. What is Sanskrit? Sanskrit is a classical Indian language. People even learn Sanskrit now in Indian universities, Sanskrit. It's a royal language. At the time of the Buddha, there are many, many languages. Just like in China now, there are many, many dialects, 30, 40 dialects. And in those days in the ancient India, it's more than 100 dialects. But the two most common ones are Pali and Sanskrit. Pali belongs to the common populace of the people, and Sanskrit more or less spoken by the royal family. So Kumarajiva learned Sanskrit and learned Chinese, and he was able to translate the sutra from Sanskrit into Chinese, a sutra about Amitabha Buddha. Now, who is Amitabha Buddha? What is the content of it? We'll deal with it. We don't need to rush. We have to take it step by step, so that after the course you know everything about Amitabha Buddha. It's important you should know about it. The lower half of the PowerPoint is says the smaller Sukhavati Vyuha, translated into English from Sanskrit by Max Muller around 1880. What's the relationship between these two? What's the relationship about the timing? Kumarajiva exists 1600 years ago, and Max Muller exists in the 1880s. What a coincidence. Max Muller was an archaeologist specializing in Sanskrit. He was a British scholar, very famous international, well-known scholar in the study of Oriental philosophy, in the study of Oriental languages. And he was also an archaeologist. Now, about 150 years ago or 200 years ago, there were a lot of expeditions, a lot of groups going into India. These archaeologists, and archaeologists started to dig relics under the ground. Soviet team, British teams, many teams were working in India. And accidentally, they dug out a lot of manuscripts written on birch bark. You know birch bark? There's a tree called birch. The bark is very thin. So they dug out from clay pots. This birch bark was stored in clay pots. And they dug it out, they opened the pots, and they find a lot of manuscripts, and they're written in birch bark, and they produced it, and these were written in Sanskrit. So they started to gather all the Sanskrit specialists and try to decipher and understand what those birch bark were all about. And Max Muller was one of the archaeologists. And he found a Sanskrit MSS stands for manuscript, a Sanskrit manuscript. By the way, since Sanskrit were found, the government put their hands on the control of the Sanskrit. The Bengal government ordered the publication of the Sanskrits, and in the present day, some of these Sanskrits were stored in British library and some in Soviet libraries. You know, they were all over the world, but they were under control. They're very valuable relics in ancient India. So Max Muller translated from Sanskrit into English. And this is what it is today. So you're reading on something, you're reading on some words, some literature translated close to 150 years ago by Max Muller. He translated from Sanskrit into English, not from Chinese. But the name that he would like to use is the smaller Sukhavati Vyuha. What is Sukhavati Vyuha? Sukhavati stands for the land of bliss, the land of happiness, or in the common English language we may call it heaven. Heaven, the land of bliss, the pure land, heaven. Vyuha means magnificent display. In other words, the content of this manuscript contains details about where is heaven. How does it look like? A magnificent display of heaven, of the land of bliss, of the land of happiness. So it contains a detailed description of where heaven is, where the land of bliss is. It also contains the Buddhist teaching as to how you can get there. Under what conditions can you get there? How do you work towards going to heaven? Not just believing in God, not just believing in Buddha, you have to know how to get there. Not just a blind belief. In other words, not just saying, I want to go to Victoria. What it says is, get the map, get the schedule of the ship. How do you get there? How do you get the money to buy the ticket? How do you drive to Nanaimo so that you can cross to Victoria? They give you all the details, not just say, that is a Victoria. It's not enough just to say there's a Victoria. How to get there? It contains all the details in there. So, Max Muller found this. Oh, he said, this is the content. Buddha says how to get a heaven, how to qualify yourself, how to get this admissions requirement to get to India, to get to heaven. So he translated it into English. This is what it is now. 150 years ago, he translated it into English. And he didn't know that there was already a Chinese book translated from Sanskrit into Chinese 1,600 years ago by Kumarajiva. And he got that Sanskrit from India. He translated already. So the two manuscripts coincidentally work out to be the same thing, but they're using different names. Now what does that mean? What does that mean? That means if we do not have Max Muller's version, we'll say, how do we know that Kumarajiva is right? Maybe he created something fake and he said something about heaven that he translated something, he pulled it out from the air. Nobody knows whether it's true or not, but it is proven now. Sanskrit discovered 1600 years later, which coincide with the content that Kumarajiva translated around 400 AD. You got the idea? That's the reason why I'm bringing out this PowerPoint to you, so that you know this is truthful. This is not fake. This is authentic. Because these are people of different times. There's no way that Max Muller talked to Kumarajiva, and Kumarajiva talked to Max Muller. Now, and then we say, okay, we have these two books. Are there any other sutras that show where heaven is, where the land of bliss is, how to go to heaven and all that? Yes. There were 3 significant sutras translated from Sanskrit into Chinese thousands of years ago. From Sanskrit into Chinese. The 3 significant sutras introducing Amitabha Buddha, commonly called the 3 sutras of the Pure Land sect of Buddhism. We're talking about a Pure Land, chanting the name of Amitabha. Why people chant Namo Amitabha, Namo Amitabha all the time? That we call the Pure Land, chanting of the Buddha's name, Pure Land sect of Buddhism. What are the most significant literature, books in that sect of the Buddhist teaching? Now here I lay it out for you. 3 of the most important ones. The Sutra on Amitabha Buddha, which is the same as the smaller Sukhavati Vyuha now here, but Kumarajiva called it the Sutra on Amitabha Buddha. They use a different title, but it's the same content. And the second sutra, the Sutra of Visualization of the Buddha of Infinite Life, translated by Kalayasa. That's even earlier than the first one, 383 to 442 AD. The first one in Chinese language, we call it 佛说阿弥陀经. The second one is 佛说观无量寿经. The Buddha of Infinite Life. Why call the Buddha Infinite Life? Is it the same as Amitabha Buddha? Yes, they are the same. Amitabha Buddha is also called the Buddha of Infinite Life. So this sutra is even more ancient than the first one. And then the third sutra, the sutra on Amitabha's Buddha, 佛说无量寿经, translated by Zamga Varman around 252 AD, which is even more ancient than the first two, 1,800 years ago. Now these are the three most important sutras. Sutra is a Sanskrit word. It means, in common English, it means discourse, manuscript. Sutra means tying up together, combining it together, tying up together like a rosary, tying all the meaning together, combining all the words together to form a discourse, to form a book. That's what a sutra is all about. So we know the literature behind it, and if you want to know more about it, you Google into it. I'm not promoting Google, but you can always get more information from it. Now is the time to learn more about it. Meditation is the basic. Now you need to go one step further. Now you need to know something very important. Why is it important? Because we're living in this world of suffering. Everybody has to die. It does not matter who you are. I always ask the question, anybody who does not have to die, raise your hand, please. I would like to learn more from you. Anybody here who does not have to die? No exception. Well, when you die, people say, what happened to me after death? They start to flip to a lot of after-death experiences to find out more information about it, and they couldn't get any answer from it. What do we do? What do we do after death? Hold your patience. We're going to know more and more about it. If you just attend this lecture for the first time and you don't plan to come back, and you're losing out. Sorry. You can Google more. This is for those who just come for the first time and who don't want to come again. These are the sutras that you should Google more into it. We say Amitabha is also called Amitabha. It's in Sanskrit language. Amita means immeasurable or boundless. Ba means light. So Amitabha Buddha means the Buddha of immeasurable and infinite life. That's the Buddha. So Amitabha Buddha means the Buddha of immeasurable light. Use means immeasurable and infinite life. Light and life is different. Immeasurable light, and use means infinite, immeasurable life, lifetime, lifespan, or longevity. Just for those who don't know too much about Buddhism, there's not just one Buddha, you know. There are millions of Buddhas. Buddhas are those people, those beings who are enlightened, who don't have to go through the karma or reincarnation. You can become the Buddha. You have that nature to become the Buddha. In other words, don't just cultivate blind faith. Just don't say, God, I'm always the follower of God. I'm always the follower of Buddha. You are your own master. You can be the master, not just the follower. You could be a follower now when you're confused, when you have the karmic force dominating you. But once all this karmic force is eliminated and you become pure, you are the Buddha. You have that Buddha inside of you. You just don't know about it. Today you should know. So if you find in the sutra, if you find out if you read Amitabha or Amitabha, they are the same. Why? It contains in the sutra that you will read about in the future. The first one, the sutra on Amitabha Buddha, it's a small version of the third one, So in other words, if you want a brief summary, the number 1 is a brief summary of number 3. Number 3 is in detail. So what is number 1 all about? On one occasion, that is 2,600 years ago, the Buddha was staying at Sravasti, northeast India, a location in northwest India, northeast India, together with 1,250 monks and many bodhisattvas. He began to address the audience headed by Sariputra, one of his disciples. And the Buddha said, to the west of this world, to that direction, there is a Buddha called the Buddha of boundless life. He's now teaching in there, in another world, not in this world, in another world, to the west, millions of miles away. Would people believe in that 2,600 years ago? We didn't even know the galaxy exists. Just about 400-500 years ago, we never believed that we can go to the moon. We always think that this world is the only world. But 2,600 years ago, the Buddha already said, this is one of the many worlds that exist. And to the west of this world, there's another world, and we call it the land of bliss, the land of happiness, where that Buddha is teaching in there. And you can go to that land, the land of bliss. You can go to that land if you train yourself chanting that name, Namo Amitabha, Namo Amitabha, the name of that Buddha. If you train yourself all the time, that at the juncture of death, you don't have any confused thoughts. You're all concentrated. And if you continue to chant that name continuously with one purity of mind, then your soul will be received in that land. In other words, Amitabha Buddha will come to receive your soul into that land of happiness. Why do we have to go there? Because this land, this world is a world of suffering. You really have to know this world before you know, why should I go there after death? This is a world of suffering. What kind of sufferings we have? Some people may not even know that we are suffering now. Do you know the kind of sufferings that we're suffering now? Well, I usually ask that question, especially that question to teenagers, and they never can imagine what kind of sufferings I have. I'm going to school. I'm licking my ice cream cone. Oh, that's happiness. I'm going to go holidays. I'm going to have parties. I'm going to play soccer ball, play my hockey. What is suffering? They don't know about it. Until you get older and older and older, then you know more about suffering. So you have to build up your wisdom to understand what are sufferings. And in the sutra, it summarizes the sufferings for you. There are 8 sufferings. Birth is suffering. Aging is suffering. Death is suffering. Sickness is suffering. The 4 sufferings. Nobody can get away from these 4 sufferings. Can you get away from aging? Can you get away from death? Can you get away from sickness? Can you get away from birth? When you crawl into your mom's embryo and you say, I don't want to go in there. I don't want to come out. Can you say that? Do you have a choice? Do you have a choice as to which family you choose to be in? You want to be into a multi-billion dollars family or in a poverty, a poor family? No. Anybody who wants to go into a poor family, raise your hand. Anybody wants to be born in a rich family, raise your hand. No, nobody wants to be born in a rich family. That's good, no attachment. No attachment. We call that born with the golden key, treasures. Now, aging is suffering, sickness is suffering, death is suffering, birth is suffering. Suffering arising from departure from beloved ones. You have beloved ones who left you. Your great-grandfathers who passed away, your father who passed away, your friends, your relative who passed away, and you agonize on it. People passed away, accidents, sickness, a lot of reasons. And you're agonizing for people who passed away. You don't want to miss, you don't want them to leave, but you have no choice. So suffering arising from departure of beloved ones. Suffering arising from living with hated ones. You hate your wife and you hate your husband. You hate your brothers and your sisters. There's so many people you hate, there's people you love. And this hatred irritates you. It breeds anger in you. That is suffering. Some people hate the society. They blame the society, blame the family, except himself. So suffering arising from living with hated ones. Suffering arising from not being able to satisfy his desires. You want to go to university, but you can't finish even grade 10. How can you go to university? You want to get a good job, but you're always unemployed. You want to have a good home, you can't. You want to raise a good family, you have nice kids, but that seems to work always against you. There's always insatiable desire in you that you cannot fulfill. You have money, you may not have health. You have health, you may not have money. You have money and health, you may not have a good family. There's always something that is deficient that you want to get. You can't get it. Isn't that suffering? Some people say, no, I want to get it by all means. Yes, you wind up going to jail. You wind up suffering, more suffering. Because you want to satisfy these insatiable desires by illegal means that induce more suffering to you in the future. I haven't mentioned a lot of others. How about human wars, genocide, atrocities arising from, and suffering arising from crimes that you don't expect, raping, killing, homicide, you name them, earthquake, tsunamis, wars, epidemic disease. All these things, do you realize these things surrounding you? And then finally you wind up in death. You wind up in sickness. Most people die from sickness. Very few people die without sickness. Most of them die in hospitals. Some were bedridden for 10 years before they died. You got that experience of seeing some of these people. A lot of suffering. If you don't know what suffering is all about, visit hospitals, nursing homes, hospital for crippled children. You visit these places and you know sufferings in here. And the sutra tells you everybody has to die anyway. After your death, don't go to this world. Go to that land, that heaven, that land of bliss where Amitabha is. He made the vow to receive your soul in there before he became the Buddha. But there are something that you have to do before you get there. Not just blind belief in, I am Buddha Amitabha. You believe in me. When you die, I get you there. No. You have to pave your way. In other words, Amitabha is the universal grand station that's sending out all this signal. You are that transistor radio in you. You need that frequency to connect to that channel. If you do not have that frequency, you cannot go there. You cannot get that universal channel. You cannot receive that channel. 1470, 1880, CHOM 900, 99.9, whatever you want to name them, you got to have that frequencies to get the radio station. That frequency is that name that you chant every day. Namo Amitabha. You build up the practice. You train your mind in getting that frequency. That at the juncture of death, no more confusion, you'll get there. Now that is what the first sutra is all about. briefly. Of course, we got to study it. It's the whole book in here. I'm just only giving you a brief introduction as to what it talks about. It talks about a magnificent display of what that heaven looks like, the location of that heaven, what appear in that heaven, who are there already. How do you train yourself to be there at the juncture of death? All that contains in there. And how do you help your relatives, your friends to get there? It's in there already. Not just say, God, I want to go there, and God will take me there. God can't take you there. Your friends cannot see you in Victoria if you don't drive to Nanaimo to cross the ferry. You need to walk. You need to drive. You got to get a ticket to cross the ferry to go to Victoria. That's what is in there. Second one is the Sutra of Visualization of the Buddha of Infinite Life, translated by Kalayasa. It contains the 16 visualizations, in other words, the 16 contemplations as to how to train your mind so that at the juncture of death, you won't have difficulty in getting in there. 16 contemplations. The 16 contemplations contain all these meditation methods that you should have. The sutra starts with a history. I'm talking about the second sutra. King Bimbisara had a son, and his son is called Amitabha Sutra, the prince. The son wanted to become a king. So he planned a plot against his father. He imprisoned his father. He imprisoned King Bimbisara by strategies. And then the queen, his mom, Vaidehi went to prison and smuggled food for her husband inside so that her husbands can eat properly. And later she was discovered, and the prince threw her in jail too. So the prince, Amitabha Sutra, put his dad and his mom in jail, the King Bimbisara and Vaidehi. Nothing happened that in history. And he planned even to kill his own father. So the queen was so sorrowful. But the queen always maintained some sort of communication with the Buddha. He communicated with the Buddha through his prayers, and he said, I don't want to live in this world. Bhagavate, the world honored one. Is there any way that I can choose to live in other worlds? Are there other worlds that I can go to, pure land that there's no suffering? I suffer so much. I'm the queen, but my son killed my husband and is planning to kill me too. I don't want to live in this world. This is a cruel world. I want to go to the world where there's no such thing happen. And the Buddha showed him all these different worlds. So that contains in that sutra. It's a longer one. The third, the Sutra on Amitabha Buddha. It contains a history of who was that practitioner before he became Amitabha Buddha. His name is Dhammakara. Many millions of kalpas ago, there was a king called Dhammakara, by the name Dhammakara, Fa Zhang Biqiu. It translated into common English, the store of the Dharma. That's his name. And he was a king at the time of the Buddha of Lokitesvara Raja. Lokitesvara Raja. That's the Buddha's name. The Buddha's name in our civilization is Buddha Sakyamuni. But in those millions of years ago, the Buddha there is Lokitesvara Raja. That's the name of the Buddha, who was Buddha then. And then there was a king, and his name is Dhammakara. He didn't want to be the king. He wanted to be a monk. He became a monk, and he made vows, 48 vows. He vowed that the content of these vows all contained in that sutra. One of the vows is, any sentient being in the future, if he chant my name, I would by all means come to his rescue and receive it into the land of happiness. So it contains a history, a biography of that sentient being, of that monk who later became Amitabha Buddha, who later became Amitabha Sutra, contains a detailed account of it, spoken by the Buddha. So that's the content of these 3 sutras. The first sentence, thus it was heard by me. And sometimes it was translated as, thus have I heard. Thus it was heard by me. In other words, this is what I hear. That's always the first sentence in a sutra. Why is there always a first sentence in a sutra? There's the story behind it. Before the Buddha passed away, the last 4 questions were asked of the Buddha. All the disciples were weeping sorrowfully, and at his bedside, the eldest disciple, there's an arahat. He already was an arahat by the name Anuruddha. There's a history behind why he became blind, because he worked so hard. He worked so hard that day and night he worked so hard that he became blind. But once he became the arahat, he could see galaxies away when he's in meditation. He was blind. He was a blind monk. He was, blind. But if he sit still and meditate, he could see everything. He still appeared as a blind arahat, but when he gathered his superpower, he immediately can see even galaxies away. So Anuruddha said to Alanda. Alanda is the attendant of the Buddha. And he says, Alanda, stop weeping. The Buddha is going to leave us. You should ask the Buddha some last questions that you have not asked before. So Alanda asked the well-known last 4 questions of the Buddha. The first question, number 1, the Buddha has been our teacher, but after his nirvana, who will be our teacher? In other words, who is our teacher? Who is our teacher who will be our teacher when the Buddha passed away? That's the first question asked of the Buddha. The second question is, when we compile the Buddha's teaching later, with what words would begin the sutra to have authority on this is true, this is authentic? How do we prove that that's what the Buddha has been talking about? That's the second question that Alanda asked. The third question, now we live with the Buddha, but when he goes to nirvana, where we will live? Without a place to live, how can we cultivate the way? Should we find someplace else to live? Where do we live? That's the third question. Very practical question. The fourth question, the Buddha can discipline evil nature, bhikshus are monks. But after he goes to nirvana, how shall we discipline them? We may not have the power, the force to discipline bad monks. So the Buddha answered these 4 questions. How about the first question? Let's do a very brief summary before we go on to the cafeteria. The Buddha has been our teacher, but after his nirvana, who will be our teacher? The Buddha said, the Vinaya is your teacher. What is the Vinaya? All the precepts that you should observe, the Pratimoksha, the Vinaya, all the disciplines, that's your teacher. In other words, doesn't have to be a human flesh and blood teacher. All those precepts that you follow, those are your teachers. Follow all the precepts that have been set to you, the 250 precepts for the bhikshus and the 348 precepts for the bhikshunis and all these other precepts for the layman, upasika and the upasaka. Follow them strictly. That combination of Vinaya is your teacher. Second, when we compile the Buddha's teaching later, what words will begin so that we know that we have the authority? And the Buddha said, you begin that with, thus have I heard. Alanda has heard it from me. Because Alanda has been an attendant with me. He attended every session of all my congregations. And he is famous for having the best memory in the group. He could memorize a lot of verses. He has the best memory. So Alanda will repeat what I will repeat in the congregation later, and the congregation will say, "Thus have I heard." That means this is what I, Alanda, have heard from the Buddha. So that's the reason why you have the 4 words. Thus have I heard. The third question. Now we live with the Buddha, so when the Buddha is gone, passed away, where should we live? You know the answer to this question? In effect, the Buddha says, I'm going to summarize it for you. Don't worry about where your body lives. So many places. But the most important is, where does your mind reside? Where does your mind live? Your body could be living in a place and your mind could be living millions of miles away. So your mind is the most important, not your body. Don't worry about your body. Your mind should be living in, should reside in, should abide in the 4 contemplations. You know the 4 contemplations? Contemplation of the body is impure, contemplation of feelings, being, suffering, contemplation of the mind being ephemeral, fleeting, impermanent, contemplation of everything as not having its real nature, as emptiness. That's where you resign your mind. Don't worry about the body. You know how to look after your body. That's your body. But do you know how to look after your mind? You always know how to bathe your body, your own body, to clean your body. Do you know how to clean your mind? How to maintain your mind? Everybody knows how to clean up his own body. You take a bath every day. Do you know how to clean up your mind? Do you have a regular bath of your own mind? Not many people. Who worry about cleaning the mind? That's what the Buddha's teaching is talking about. Cleaning your mind is more important, is as important or more important as cleaning your body. The 4th question. The Buddha can discipline ill-natured bhikshus, but after he goes to Nirvana, how shall we discipline them? The answer is very simple. Ignore them. Don't argue. Don't fight. Just cool, without attachment, let them. Ignore them. Ignore them and don't live with them. Don't agree with them. You just ignore them. So don't argue. Don't say that this Sankhya is bad, that monk is bad. Don't badmouth on the other monks. Just ignore them.